A lot of people don't truly understand the foundational Black American experience. I want somebody to type FBA in the chat room. Somebody type FBA in the chat room. Our history is different. Our history is unique. Our culture is different. When you tell somebody whose family is from Detroit or Chicago or Los Angeles or Oakland, something happened, something racial happened in South Carolina. Hell, if you tell somebody in Houston something racial happened in South Carolina, they'll say, yeah, that figures. Yep, that's about right. So you need to understand where this happened. This happened on Park Lane Road in Columbia, South Carolina. It's in Dentsville, and that's in northeast Columbia area of Richland County. In that particular county, Black people make up 2/3 of the population or more. What I need you to understand, and my cousin lives in South Carolina. Dentsville sits and right over there near Columbia, actually. So Dentsville sits inside the old South Carolina Midlands. And this region was deeply shaped by slavery and plantation culture and forced Black labor, and then later Reconstruction, violence, and Jim Crow and racial control. Richland County was part of the plantation world. The Goodwill Plantation, the Kenningson Plantation in Lower Richland was a massive plantation with thousands of enslaved Black people who were forced to work and cultivate cotton and rice in this region. It was built by enslaved Black peoples, torture, labor, crimes against humanity, generational grape. Our ancestors, our foundational Black ancestors, cleared the land. They planted cotton, they planted rice, they dug the canals, they dealt with the malaria, they worked in the fields, they worked in homes, they raised white folk children, they raised their own children, they did all of that under bondage. They buried family members there in that soil they didn't own. And they created communities under conditions of force. And these enslaved Black people in South Carolina, these Midlands, they were not passive people. They resisted. Somebody type resisted in the chat room. In 1816, in this same Midland region, there was what was called a slave conspiracy. At that time, enslaved Black men reportedly, they had planned to rise up on the 4th of July of 1816 and steal weapons at an unguarded arsenal and attack and kill their oppressors. Now, the plot was betrayed before it could happen. 7 of these men were convicted, and on July 15th, they were hung. But they plotted because they wanted their freedom. And the white response was not, oh, freedom for all, liberty and justice. It was death. It was public punishment to exhibit fear and exact more control. And then when we roll around to the Civil War, after it ended, slavery was legally abolished. But most of the Black people who were from that area, who were enslaved in that area, they stayed in those same counties and the surrounding areas because that's where their families were. That's where their churches were. That's where their ancestors were buried. That's where everything they had known in the world existed. They were tenant farmers. They were sharecroppers. They had developed houses and schools and churches. But as you all know, just from those of you all who listen to this channel, white folk didn't just accept that. The white power structure didn't accept Black freedom like that. It responded with Black oppression and Black codes and forced labor and political terror. During Reconstruction in 1876, there was an election during that season. And there was a wave of what we'll call civil disturbances, but more likely was racial terror tied to the white folks who were Democrats and what they called the red shirt paramilitary groups. These were white racists. They were trying to overthrow the Black political power and the Republican Reconstruction government that had been put in place by the Union Army. Because remember, the Union soldiers were still there. And so they had these armed white men who favored wearing red shirts, and they used fear and threats and beatings and violence to stop black people from voting and organizing and holding political power, or even trying to act like an equal after slavery was over. There was a famous massacre. It was called the Hamburg Massacre in July 1867. Hamburg was a town that came about after it was a black reconstruction town. It was a place where formerly enslaved black people were trying to live as free, organized, politically organized people where they try to protect themselves and exist as citizens after slavery. On July 4th, again, ain't that something? The 4th of July. A lot of stuff happens on the 4th of July. It's the day white folk oftentimes decide to reassert themselves. But on the 4th of July, 1876, a black militia company, in other words, armed black men led by a gentleman named Doc Adams, decided to march through town. Okay? Now, Doc Adams was the black commander of the Hamburg Militia Company in Aiken County, South Carolina. Hamburg was a majority black reconstruction town. It was right across from the Savannah River in near Augusta, Georgia. Think about the symbolism of that. I want you to picture this. You have formerly enslaved black men wearing uniforms, carrying weapons, marching in public on the 4th of July, celebrating American freedom in a town. It was like a parade, right? In a town where black people were trying to live and be free. And that sight just enraged white men who believed black people had no right to stand up like citizens. In other words, they believed that black people had no right to defend themselves or even pretend to defend themselves. I want you to remember that concept. Nevertheless, you had two white men, one named Thomas Butler and another one named Henry Gitson. Now, as the parade was going on, these two white men demanded to cut through the militia formation, basically just walk all through it. And guess what that led? That just was an excuse for a confrontation. So you got all these black men with guns marching in formation in what is basically a parade, and you got two white men who just want to cut through. They want to just pass on the road. But you know the real issue was that you had armed black men organized, black men voting, politically active black men, and that scared the hell out of the white power structure. So anyway, a few days later, by July 8th, 1876, you had more than 100 armed white men came to Hamburg, and these weren't people trying to calm things down. These were white supremacist political terrorists. And they surrounded the black militia members. They demanded their weapons. They wanted to humiliate them. They wanted them to surrender. They wanted to send a message that black men couldn't organize, were not allowed to defend themselves, and couldn't march, couldn't vote, and couldn't act like equal citizens in South Carolina. And a fight ensued. The black militia members took cover. They were outnumbered. White mob brought overwhelming force, and the situation turned into a slaughter. After the Hamburg Massacre, 94 white men were indicted for murder. 94 white men. Can you imagine that? 94 white men were indicted for murder. And among those names were some very powerful white men who were not treated like criminals. They were treated like respectable citizens afterward. They weren't put in handcuffs. This is the area that this situation happened in. Somebody type FBA in the chat room. One of the gentlemen, his name was Matthew Calbraith Butler. He was a former Confederate general and a lawyer. Now, during the Hamburg confrontation, he showed up as a private lawyer to represent the angry group of white men and stood out there and demanded that the militia disband and turn over their weapons. Now, I want you to understand something. Matthew Butler had no lawful authority to command anybody, especially the black militia, to surrender their guns to him personally. He was a private citizen. But yet he stood in front of this white mob and demanded the black militia to disarm themselves. And he was indicted. But he wasn't punished for murder. Actually, he went on to become the United States Senator for South Carolina from 1877 to 1895. Think about that. And that's the point. Even today, South Carolina still honors this man inside the State House. In the Senate gallery, there's a portrait of Matthew C. Butler honoring him as a South Carolina House member, a United States Senator from 1876 to 1897, and a Confederate general, and later a major in the United States Army during the war against Spain. So he wasn't punished, he was upgraded.